Today we are revisiting the AMD Ryzen 2000 series. So we've got the 2600, the R5s, the 2700 R7s, and we threw in the R5 1600AF, basically a 2600, just because it was a really popular CPU when it was briefly available for $85. Sorry, we ruined that when we published our review back when it came out. They got scalped. But we're back now to look at them because there's new stuff from AMD and from Intel, but more importantly, the prices have absolutely plummeted on the 5000 series options, and you can find 3000 series options for kind of cheap on eBay now. So this might be a good time just for a drop-in upgrade rather than a totally new build. But we have benchmarks for both, so it can help guide you to what you want to do for the next few months for your system building options. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Height Y60. The Height Y60 is one of the most unique cases to launch anytime recently, coming in multiple color options like this bright red, and it's also built for both water cooling and air cooling. The case pays extreme attention to detail, particularly with cable management paths like you can see with the quality rubber grommets that are always passed through, and with split lower and upper chambers. Learn more at the link in the description below. So first thing, if you're upgrading from Ryzen 2000 to maybe a 5000 series, 3000 series, first thing you need to do is go check the CPU compatibility list on the motherboard page to make sure the CPU you're considering is on that list. Because older boards, especially like X370, 470, don't necessarily support the newest AM4 CPUs. And AMD, if you've been out of the loop, is on AM5 now. They just launched the 7000 series, but 5000 series stuff still available new. It's dwindling, but the pricing's really good on it. So that's why we're doing this revisit now, especially because you've got full perspective on everything between when 2000 came out and the newest stuff to see where to go with it. But board compatibility matters a lot for this. And then also VRM compatibility. I think a lot of people will probably overlook this aspect just looking at the BIOS support. But if you bought a lower end board back in the day that was good enough for, say, a 2600, 2700, just make sure the VRM is sufficient if you're going to do a huge extreme jump to a 5090-50X or something like that to support it without burning up. But for something like 5600X, you're going to be fine in almost all cases. All right, so enough of the compatibility stuff. Let's take a look at pricing just really quickly. The Ryzen 5 5600X, the 6-core, is available brand new for $160 at the time of filming, and the 8-core 5800X is about $250. So those are potentially compelling options because the most it'll take to use them is, again, just the motherboard updates. You don't need to buy everything else in the system. The 5800X 3D is another super popular option due to its gaming performance, but it's also more expensive. It's come down, though. It's around $330 now, and it's starting to face some availability issues in the market, so that'll run low on supply. Now, these are better deals than anything you're going to get if you do a brand new build, but a brand new build, you could make the argument that, but moving to AM5, you'll be looking at this in another 3 years or whatever, and you'll have a lot more options then to keep going. It's just when do you pull the lever on when to swap the platform itself. One other thing for our testing here today, so we went back and we overclocked everything just to the same numbers we did back when we reviewed those parts. If you remember, a lot of the Ryzen 2000 stuff capped at 4.1, 4.2 gigahertz. That's where we landed for most of our overclocks, and your mileage may vary on the actual voltage used and everything else. But these numbers give you an idea for a 2600X and a 2700X. They are really close to just running a 2700X when you overclock a 2700 non-X to 4+ gigahertz. So we've given you all the numbers for the 2000 series. Just swap that X for the OC and you're close enough to make a judgment. Okay, let's get into the benchmarks and then we'll talk about the judgments at the end. In CSGO at 1080p, the good news is that all of the CPUs on the chart except the Ryzen 1700 are able to maintain at least 144 FPS average. Aside from improving frame time consistency or shaving milliseconds off of the overall response time, there's just not much reason to upgrade in this particular game. The best Ryzen 2000 CPU in this scenario is the R5 2600 at 175 FPS average, which is 9% faster than the 2700, and it's in very close competition with the 1600AF. That's no surprise though, because the 1600AF is basically a 2600 just with a different name. It was a weird launch, we reviewed it. It was sold for like $85 and a lot of people bought it. As for the 2700, remember that higher core count parts, especially back in the earlier Ryzen days, didn't always perform better because base and boost were adjusted with those clocks in order to just maintain stability. A simple 4.2 gigahertz overclock on the 2600 pushes it 13% higher to 198 FPS average. That more or less emulates 2600X, and it shows you that you can squeeze a bit more performance out of these non-X parts if you just want to stretch your current build a little bit further into the future. As for the 5600X, that shares the same AM4 socket, and it nets an 83% improvement over the stock 2600. Makes it a strong candidate for a drop-in upgrade as long as your motherboard supports it, both the VRM and the BIOS, and at $160, it's especially compelling right now. If you're looking for the biggest jump you can make possible in the same socket, regardless of the rest of the costs, the more expensive 5800X 3D is 22 FPS average ahead of where the 5600X left off. If you've been running an original Zen 1 part since 2017, a drop-in upgrade would actually be a pretty big improvement here. But you do, again, need to check to make sure your BIOS is compatible, that the motherboard's been brought forward for new compatibility, and that the VRM can handle it. So moving to like a 5600X, probably not going to be a problem on most of the VRMs. You move to like a 5950X, you might run into issues. So do double check on the capability of your original motherboard and if you need to upgrade that as well. A buying into current gen platforms would obviously give the best overall performance. So a 13600K, for example, more or less doubles, actually more than doubles, the 2600 performance, and it pushes 1% lows into 200 plus FPS territory. Pretty massive. Also, a completely new computer build at that point, not an upgrade. And the 7600X as another example, it's a bit faster, 383 FPS average in that chart, and these are big performance jumps, but again, cost of a new computer versus, say, 5000 series or even 3000 series may be used. At 1440p, CSGO shows us how CPU bound it is, which is a good thing for CPU testing. The nearly identical scaling and the placement of all parts on the chart being more or less the same helps to illustrate that we are still CPU bound. All the same comparisons as 1080p apply, so we'll move on. Far Cry 6 is next, where the Ryzen 2000 CPUs make up the bottom portion of the chart, behind even the 12100F. The 2600 at stock ran at 86 FPS average, functionally tying with the 2700 and the 1600AF. The 2700 with an OC to 4.1 gigahertz here raises it 11% over the 2600 to 96 FPS average. That's not bad for more or less a free upgrade, although free here comes with some cost of thermals and power, and the CPU does actually have to overclock that high. Best in class AM4 choices here have the 5600X running 52% faster than the 2600, and the 58X 3D even further ahead at 110% faster, with the X3D beyond even the new 7600X. Going with one of these Ryzen 5000 choices will go a long way towards alleviating a CPU bottleneck for the least cost if you're thinking about stepping up to a higher end GPU in the near future, or maybe you've already done so. The most modern choices, by comparison, don't look as compelling, at least in Far Cry 6, with the even 7950X actually performing worse than the 58X 3D in this game with our set of tests. Intel's 13600K is also only slightly ahead. If you're on a decent AM4 board already, your best move here is going to be to stick with the platform and get a 5000 series CPU. Final Fantasy XIV's Endwalker benchmark is relatively new to our test suite, and it's been proving good for scaling so far. The Zen Plus CPUs are tightly packed, and the R5 2600 lands on the chart at 133 FPS average, tied with the 10400 and the 1600AF. And again, the AF makes sense here. It narrowly beats the 2700. The 1600AF gets a 7% uplift with an OC and leads its contemporaries here, running a bit faster than the 2700. It's worth overclocking if you already own one of these CPUs, and it doesn't take too long to do it. Moving up to a Ryzen 5000 CPU still nets improvements, but not as aggressively as in previous games. The 5600X runs at 181 FPS average, 36% ahead of the 2600, and the 58X 3D is faster than that still. If this game's in really heavy rotation for you and you want the absolute biggest uplift you can get, a 5800X 3D does pretty well. It's possibly a drop-in upgrade, and the 13600K as a new build would also be a big upgrade. That's 89% faster than a 2600. Pretty big change there. You'd be able to keep your RAM if you go to a DDR4 board. You're not necessarily maximizing it, but you do cut down on the cost, and you get most of the performance as we showed in our DDR4 and 5 testing previously with Alder Lake, and it's more or less the same type of idea. So this is especially compelling as opposed to like a DDR5 option with the 7600X, for example. In GTA 5, which was more relevant when the 2000 series came out. The R5 2600 tested at 88 FPS average, tied with the 2700 and barely beating the 1600 AF. But it obviously falls behind the overclocked results. The best of those is the 2700, getting 12% more average FPS when overclocked versus its stock configuration, and that would make it somewhat comparable to a 2700X. It represents the best Ryzen 2000 performance that we were able to get with simple work in this particular game. Compared to that OC result, the 5600X runs 36% faster, and the 58X3D is considerably better at 178 FPS average. Rainbow Six Siege is so easy to run that everything here averages over 300 FPS except for the R7 1700. That means all these CPUs give way more than playable performance, but we can still explore the scaling between them, especially for those of you who are ultra competitive and really do want every frame. Ryzen 3000 CPUs could offer a decent mid-step upgrade here, but for an upgrade, we'd prefer the 5600X. New and used examples alike are around $160 at the time of writing, and picking one up would get you a 71% uplift in average FPS over the 2700 or 2600, and it would push even 0.1% lows over 300 FPS. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, the Ryzen 2700 is within variance of the 2600, and it leads the 1600 AF by a very narrow margin. There's no meaningful difference between these Ryzen 2000 CPUs unless you overclock, where the 2700 with an OC gains 9%. So not bad for free, sort of, but not super exciting either. It creates a small lead over both the 2600 and 16AF when overclocked as well. The AM4 upgrade path looks pretty good here, with the 5600X grabbing a 65% lead over the 2700 at stock, and the 58X3D taking the top of the chart at 267 FPS average. Here's what Tomb Raider looks like when more restricted on the GPU at 1440p. Everything from the 5800X and up is functionally tied, with the 5600X right behind it at 194 FPS average, offering 47% more uplift over the 2700 and slightly more over the 1600 AF. So that's not as wide of a gap as 1080p, clearly, and it's mostly just a reminder that depending on your GPU, the highest end CPU doesn't necessarily actually get you gains in frame rate if you are GPU bound. And with a 3090 Ti, for a lot of these newer CPUs, it actually does become a GPU bind at 1440p in most of these games, CSGO notwithstanding. Total Warhammer 3 is our last gaming test, and it also suffers from poor scaling at the top end thanks to GPU bottlenecks becoming closer to the top here. The R7 2700 ran at 143 FPS average, which is slightly ahead of the 2600. Total War gets some extra benefit from the additional 2 cores, and overclocking the 2700 boosts average FPS 11% over stock. The 5600X offers a respectable 34% uplift over the 2700, and the 58X3D gets a little bit more than that. The 7600X and 13600K aren't worth the cost here, so if you'd like to upgrade for cheap, we'd say skip the more expensive options and stick with the 5600X. Now we're moving on to production tests, and this is pretty cool because this is where Ryzen initially established itself as a potential option in the market. It wasn't that strong in gaming originally. It got there over time, but this was its mainstay for at least 2 sort of initial launches of Ryzen CPUs. For this, we're dropping the 58X3D comparisons in favor of the 5800X. The extra cache doesn't really help in these tests. And for the rest, you really just want to pay attention to the 5800X, 5600X, and maybe the 13600K. And the 58X right now is $250, brand new, not even used on eBay at the time of writing. So that's pretty compelling, but let's see how it does. First up is Blender, where we time the completion of a custom GN logo render. Any kind of heavily threaded application like this is going to scale well with more cores, and it shows here. The 2700 finished the test in 25.3 minutes. It's 18% faster than the 2600 actually. Pushing the 2700 a bit further with an overclock has it complete the render in 15% less time than stock, which is worthwhile if you don't mind the extra power. The 5600X gives some improvement over the 2700, but the 5800X is obviously more impressive because it has more cores and this is thread-bound at a 37% time reduction. That's significant in this kind of work where the time savings can get you onto the next project faster. The 13600K is worth considering as a middle ground because it completes the render 58% faster than the 2700, and moving to the Intel platform would allow you to keep your DDR4. Next up is our code compile test for programmers in the audience. The 2700 finished the job in 138 minutes, leading the 2600 by 15%. Overclocking is again worth doing as it gets the compile down to 121 minutes, which is 12% less time than the stock 2700. Just like in Blender, stepping up to a 5800X would be good value. It's 37% less time required to complete the compile than the 2700, and it has a wider gap between it and the 2600 given the core advantage and cache. This is going to be your best value upgrade option here. If instead you're considering moving to a totally new system from the 2700, the 41% faster 13600K is still a better choice than the 7600X here, just in terms of price to performance. Obviously, you could go up to a 7950 or 13900K for better absolute performance, but it's a totally different price class. We test file compression with 7-zip, where the score is measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. The 2700 is the best early Ryzen CPU in this test, on par with a 10600K. Overclocking brings the 2700 up by 12%, narrowing the gap between it and the 6-core 5600X. That's respectable for the aging 8-core here. That said, the 5800X pushes 50% ahead of the overclocked 2700, and it doubles the performance of the 1600AF. If your workflow utilizes a lot of file compression, it's worth looking at the 58X as an upgrade. The 7600X doesn't offer much over the 5800X in compression, but the 13600K is 110% more performance than our overclocked 2700 and would be a good candidate for a fresh build. Moving to decompression, we see more scaling between some of the CPUs, with the 2700 now holding a 21% advantage over the 2600. The 5800X runs 59% ahead of the stock 2700, handily defeating the 7600X, and it's not too far off from a 13600K due to Zen's inherent advantage in decompression, at least as we test it here. Adobe Premiere testing is next. The score is aggregated from a set of functions that include transforms, filters, live playback, lumetri scopes, scrubbing, and all of that stuff. The 2700 predictably leads the 2600, and overclocking puts it 12% higher than stock and tied with the 12400 and 5600X. Not bad. At stock, the 2700 gives up a 35% lead to the 5800X, which ties the 7600X. Photoshop is up now. The performance bump you'd get from moving to the 5800X is less pronounced, as its 47% improvement over the 2700 is closely followed by the 5600X's. If you only work in Photoshop and not in more thread-bound applications, you'd be better off saving the money by going with the 5600X as an in-socket upgrade. Now, you can get a lot more performance in Photoshop by starting fresh, obviously. 13600K, once again, looking pretty compelling if you do a new build. 7600X, also pretty good. They both double the stock 2700 in terms of aggregate points, and once you weigh the added cost and you measure it versus how much time you actually spend using Photoshop to make graphics or edit photos, that's how you come to the conclusion of if it's worth it or not. But if you're not in Photoshop basically daily, it's probably not worth doing a brand new build just for gains here. Now for power consumption. For this, we do our testing measuring the power at the EPS 12 volt cables, so it's not total system power. That means that we're able to look at more or less just the CPU power before VRM efficiency losses, so you get a complete picture of how much is getting pulled into just the CPU. The early Ryzen non-X CPUs don't draw much power in an all-core workload. The 2700's at 76 watts here, with the 2600 and 1600AF a little higher than that. That changes with the overclock, and the overclock numbers will change based on your voltage and board. But we see here the 2700 is now more than double its stock power draw at 180 watts, and the 2600 goes up to 145 watts. Our AM4 upgrade pick for production, the 5800X, is at 127 watts here, so still pretty manageable, and the 5600X manages to come in lower than anything else on the chart except the quad-core 12100F. The last one's pretty interesting. This is power efficiency. We didn't make these charts back when we reviewed the 2000 series originally. Combining our Blender results and power readings gives us the efficiency here, where the constant is the unit of work done, one rendered frame, and the results are calculated as watt hours. The overclocked 2700, 2600, and 1600AF take impressively bad but expected positions at the bottom of the chart, and that's because overclocking is, by nature, very inefficient. Moving on to the 6 cores, the 5600X calculated at 25 watt hours, and that's 42% more efficient, or 42% less energy consumed for the work done than the 2600. Which is good as a generational improvement. Concluding that, first of all, overclocking is absolutely worth considering if you haven't yet. Ryzen 2000 it stood to gain a lot more from just an all-core overclock. Really simple, easiest possible OC to do. Be careful of VSOC, watch guides from back when the CPUs came out. We posted a few comments in some of our reviews initially, and just be careful with the SoC voltage. But for the most part, it's really simple to do an all-core OC, push it to 4.1, 4.2, something like that. And actually, we haven't tested the most recent silicon before they stop production. Maybe it's even better. But either way, you're gaining anywhere from at the low end, maybe 9% up to 13+% just for an OC, which is kind of a free thing to do. If you're on an X series CPU, you don't have much to gain. Maybe a little bit, but worth considering an OC either way. So upgrade options. We think the 5600X at $160 makes sense for most users, especially who are on an R5 previously, and you stand to gain a lot actually in a lot of these gaming charts. The 5800X at $250, also very worth considering, but the 58X3D at $340, since it's kind of out of stock now, that option's going away. Quick recaps on the numbers. So CSGO 5600X was 83% faster than a 2600. The X3D was 95% faster. And Far Cry 6, the 5600X was 52% faster than a 2600. X3D was 110% faster. Final Fantasy XIV wasn't as impressive. 5600X was 36% faster than a 2600. Blender had the 5800X, 37% faster than a 2700. And power overall, it was pretty low on these CPUs back when they came out, and it's still low now. It looks even lower now. The efficiency is not as impressive as some of the stuff today, but power is not really as much of a thing to worry about. So those are your options. If it's worth upgrading, obviously, that's going to come down to you. That's not being wishy-washy on our end. Same thing we always say, evaluate your computer right now, and you basically ask yourself one simple question, which is, am I happy with the performance? And if you are forcing an answer because there's a bunch of new stuff, then it maybe isn't worth upgrading yet. But if you actually are struggling with, say, completing renders in a timely fashion, maybe you just aren't happy with the frame rate, then sure, an upgrade makes sense. And a drop-in upgrade will get you pretty damn far if you can't spare a ton of cash for a brand new build. Brand new build will get you a lot too. Like 13th gen stuff it's going to stretch pretty far for gaming performance. But the result you can get for under $300 is really impressive here. And it does stand to sort of defend the position of keeping a platform alive for a long time for users who are more cash constrained and just want to buy something on eBay or buy new old stock as it's being phased out and keep things going. One last note closing out here that I think we don't mention it enough, and it's probably we should mention it more. A lot of times when people are unhappy with the performance of a computer that's maybe more than a year old, especially if it's not that old, like at 1.5 years, the actual issue is a Windows install. Keep that in mind too. If you want to do one last ditch effort, maybe you feel like it's underperforming where it should compared to some numbers you see online, obviously keeping in mind that methodology matters when you're taking those numbers, maybe try, if you don't want to commit to a full OS reinstall, you could pull the SSD you're using, put a new one in, especially if you're going to buy one anyway, do a clean install. Or if you don't really care about what's on there, you just back up what you need and then blow it all away and do a new OS. It's possible that you wipe out enough just sort of aged bloat from Windows, even if you've been clean with your software, that it suddenly speeds up and random issues like freezes, crashes, or software crashes, things like that, they might all go away. Certainly, that's been the experience I've had with a lot of the older systems we've maintained here at the office. You reset Windows or do a clean install, and suddenly it's like it's a brand new computer. Yeah, the frame rate's not as good as modern stuff, but if you get rid of the stuttering issues or whatever random basically defects you're experiencing in software, that might be all you need. And that's more or less free other than your time to back stuff up. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching as always. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly in paying for the time to test all this stuff, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. And subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.